Testing, testing, testing. Sound. In the early 1920s and 30s, when film first started to expand from silent to sound, America and other countries had to move the battle to other grounds. Each country wanting to dominate these new grounds had to break into the worldwide market, and each had the same obstacle. How do we get those who do not speak our language to watch and understand our media? Sound had created this obstacle, and a new arms race began. Now that the worldwide stage is set, let's focus on one topic in particular, dubbing. Dubbing was originally split into three important applications. These were all set out by George Lewin in his piece Dubbing and Its Relation to Sound, Picture, and Production, featured in the Journal of the Society of Motion Picture Engineers of January 1931. The first topic is re-recording of a completed feature from one form to another. This is oftentimes in the form of film to disc or disc to film. Most of these uses are mainly focused on quality improvement. While most of these improvements meant fixing small errors in the original recording and improving that for the final recording, some of this was used from simple houses that could not use film and had to use disc. So most times these were used to transfer from disc to film to disc, to where they were going to be shown. The second major piece is re-recording the dialogue for the purpose of mixing in with it sound effects or incidental music, which for technical or economic reasons could not have been put in during the original recording. One of the most important is recreating background noise that would be dubbed in later. Most of this noise would be impossible to record while you're originally shooting the film. This could include trains, crowds, gunshots, thunder, any type of weather, and these would incur a much smaller cost, as they could be recorded with a smaller crew, and these sounds could be dubbed anytime later, be much less expensive and time consuming for these smaller crews to get these small pieces of sound and put them in on over top of the original dialogue to not hide the conversation we want to hear. This would also greatly impact editing. If sounds were recorded originally, it would hard to be edited when you're trying to piece together these random assortments of sound. If you record the sounds afterwards, you can simply dub them in and not worry about it in the editing process. The last of these big three is a synchronizing of foreign voices to a picture that was recorded in English originally, which George refers to as doubling. This is when we use the same set of actors and same film, but instead use a different cast to sync with the lips of those on screen, that it may be recorded in a different language. While this is a massive time investment, it is much cheaper than other alternatives. One of the main alternatives used in films such as The Big Pond was using two entirely different casts, one in the original English language and another in another language such as French. While this is much more expensive, some of these films could not handle that sort of cost because most of them relied on big stars and big actors to carry the names. Some of these stars, who were once silent stars, were killed by this transition. They could not make the transition to acting while also speaking and using sound. Some of these actors used what modernly we would call lip syncing. They had a totally different person speaking their lines, dubbing over the film. It is somewhat wild to think that even though George says this problem died in 1931, some of today's stars have used lip syncing to try and spring their careers into the limelight if they didn't have to have the talent to back up this limelight. George goes on to state that in the recording of this and in the dubbing process, it would take many projections and include up to 7 sound mixtures for each track, one for the dialogue, one for the train noise, one for the soundtrack, one for even the crowd music, and it would just be wild to show him now that we can do many of these things in the simple press of a button on a computer. An entire room full of electronics has been transported into handheld devices. It would be wild to show him that this process is much simpler now, and that we have streamlined the process. Next is America is the greatest thing to ever happen to the rest of the world. while Nathan Golden, in his piece Sound Motion Pictures in Europe, featured in the Journal of the Society of Motion Picture Engineers of January 1930, didn't explicitly state this, it is heavy in the tone that we are the greatest. And while some statistics show this, it isn't always the full case. Much of Europe was advancing in sound just as we were. While we were maybe a year or two ahead in the game, many countries like Great Britain had theaters that could fit sound, and even other countries like Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, as many countries as you could name in the area, had fully adopted sound. One of the only countries that didn't quite take this adoption well was Germany, who had very strict regulations on silent film, which carried over to sound film. They had very few of their own sound film past censorships, so getting in sound films from other countries was almost impossible. Nathan also says that America was in the forefront of this, and in this first 6 months of 1929, we had exported over 121 million feet of linear film. He wasn't as worried much about the dubbing of film because he believed that America would solve this issue no problem. We would have no issues expanding, and he also think it'd be about 2 years before the total sound installations of the European countries would reach that of the United States. And what surprised me the most about his piece is that in the year 1929, Great Britain had over 1,500 theaters that could fit around 1,500 people, which is insane to think about because I work in a modern theater that can barely fit 1,500 people, and it is almost 100 years later. Not that you needed proof that I did work in the theater, but I often wonder that if 100 years ago, the people that were watching films then were just as messy as those watching now. The last person I want to reference is Joe Kaufman and his piece Art and Science in Sound Film Production. He states that silent film is made or marred in the cutting room, and similarly, in the not-so-distant future, it will be genuinely admitted that a talking picture is made or marred in the dubbing room. While both editing and dubbing play a major role in today's film, we often expect when we walk into a theater that the editing and sound is going to be perfectly fine. But at the time, this was a totally new invention, a totally new way to experience film. And Kaufman also believed that the almost 7 million Americans who walked into films in the 1930s daily walked into these films not to seek representation of their own lives, but to seek relief, and making the sound, dubbing, and editing perfect would not break this immersion, which is why I thought about dubbing today. While the process has changed, and I'd like to show Kaufman the MacBook that I'm recording this on, to show him all the gadgets and ways it can record sound and produce video, just like I wanted to show George. I like to focus on the idea of dubbing as a way to escape reality. In the past year or so, with the pandemic, millions of Americans have streamed many types of videos, and in recent times, we can experience foreign film at our fingertips through these streaming platforms. We have witnessed greats like Parasite, and in more recent times, Squid Game, which has inspired this piece. There are 2 ways to view these films, and either way you choose, you'll be pitted directly against the other side. Should I watch this subtitled, or should I watch this dubbed? And while many believe the subtitle is the best way to view the film, because we can experience it in its natural habitat, some view dubbing as an easy alternative. So a topic now almost 100 years old has reached the limelight of the year 2021. Dubbing, while generally easier for a viewer to understand, is still a difficult process. While we may not need 7 monitors and 7 sound mixers and 7 different recordings, and everything might be right at the tip of our fingers, we still have the process of finding a totally new cast and matching with the lips of the original film. As Anna states And what is dubbing in a movie and how does it work? Dubbing isn't simply translating and then putting that dialogue over the film that is already in place. That is simply voiceover. Dubbing is creating the new script, finding a script whose words line up well with the lips of the original film, and then the most important part is finding talent that their voice may match the characters on screen. Then we have to record the dialogue, which is a lot easier in today's times. We're not using those 7 machines. We're not lining all these pieces up. It's as simple as selecting tracks in the editing process on a modern computer. It is somewhat the same general principle. We are layering these tracks of the new script and the new dialogue on top of the old film in order to line up the lips with the new voices in order to dub the film, or as George would call it, doubling. While the idea is similar, we face some of the same problems that they did back in the 1930s, such as finding talent and then also distributing. What is much easier today with modern streaming services, distributing is still somewhat difficult because we want to convey information to an audience while keeping the identity of the film intact. We want to keep that core idea intact, but make it in a way that they may be able to understand it better. The modern era has created much discourse with the idea of dubbing. Are you a filthy person who's going to watch something dubbed, or are you a sophisticated individual who will watch it in its original form and simply read the subtitles as you watch the film? While either way, you may still get the same conveyed information to you. Some believe that dubbing is almost taboo, but it is a great way to convey information to people who may otherwise not be able to access this type of film. It is also a very great and inexpensive way to streamline the editing process and make sure that we can get background noise, crowd noise, and weather noises in modern film without distracting us from dialogue.